The human body was never designed for what you're about to hear. These are the stories of ordinary people who found themselves in the most unimaginable circumstances, people who stared death in the face, and, through some combination of sheer willpower, luck, and an almost primal refusal to give up, came out on the other side. These are the most extreme survival stories ever recorded. On the morning of April 26, 2003, a 27-year-old mechanical engineer from Colorado named Aron Ralston woke up in the back of his truck in southeastern Utah. It was a Saturday, sunny and warm, the kind of day that pulled him out of bed and into the desert like a magnet. He had driven out to Canyonlands National Park the night before, planning a solo trip through Blue John Canyon, an 11-mile-long slot canyon that snakes through sandstone and narrows in some places to barely 3 feet wide. It was well within his ability. Aron was an experienced outdoorsman, a former search and rescue volunteer, and an accomplished mountaineer who had already climbed most of Colorado's 14ers, the 59 peaks that rise above 14,000 feet. He was confident, maybe too confident, because on that particular morning, he broke one of the most basic rules of wilderness travel. He didn't tell a single person where he was going. Aron had recently quit a well-paying engineering job to pursue mountaineering full-time. He had moved to Aspen, Colorado, where he spent his days climbing, skiing, and pushing himself in every direction the wilderness would allow. His goal was to eventually summit Denali, the highest peak in North America, and Blue John Canyon was meant to be little more than a warm-up, a casual solo adventure before heading back to more ambitious pursuits. He had already survived an avalanche earlier that year in the Colorado mountains, tumbling several hundred feet before digging himself out. He was accustomed to risk. He thrived on it. He rode his bike 15 miles to the mouth of the canyon, locked it up, and started walking. For a couple of hours, everything was perfect. The canyon walls rose high on either side of him, the sandstone glowing gold and red in the afternoon light, the silence broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. Then, at around 2:45 in the afternoon, while he was scrambling down through a narrow section, a boulder the size of a small car shifted above him. It happened in an instant. The rock fell, first crushing his left hand, and then slamming his right hand and wrist against the canyon wall with the full weight of 800 pounds behind it. He was pinned, 100 feet below the desert surface, 20 miles from the nearest paved road, with no phone, no way to call for help, and no one in the world who knew where he was. For 5 days, Aron Ralston lived in that narrow crevice. He rationed the small amount of water he had, roughly 12 ounces, and slowly ate the only food in his pack, 2 burritos. He tried everything to free himself. He chipped at the boulder with his cheap multi-tool. He tried to shift it with leverage. Nothing worked. The rock would not move. By the 3rd day, dehydrated and delirious, he accepted that he was going to die. He carved his name, his date of birth, and what he believed would be his date of death into the sandstone wall. He filmed goodbye messages to his family on his little video camera, words he never expected anyone to hear, but that he needed to say. By the 5th day, his water was gone. He resorted to drinking his own urine. And then something changed. As he drifted in and out of consciousness that night, he had a vision, a hallucination so vivid it felt more real than the canyon around him. He saw himself, years in the future, playing with a small child, a boy. And in the vision, he was missing his right arm. When he woke the next morning, his 6th day trapped, he noticed something. His arm had started to decompose. The flesh below the boulder was dead, and the bones, starved of circulation, had become brittle. In that moment, something clicked. He realized he could use torque against the trapped limb to snap his own radius and ulna, the two bones of his forearm. What followed was an hour of agony that is almost impossible to comprehend. Using his dull 2-inch pocket knife, a tool so cheap it came free with a $15 flashlight, Aron Ralston amputated his own arm. He cut through skin and muscle, using the pliers on his multi-tool to sever the tougher tendons, leaving the major arteries for last. He fashioned a tourniquet from a piece of camelback tubing and tied it tight. And then, with blood streaming down what remained of his right arm, he stood up for the first time in nearly 6 days. But his ordeal was far from over. He still had to climb out of the slot canyon, rappel down a 65-foot sheer rock face with one arm, and then hike 7 miles through the desert to reach his vehicle. After about 6 miles, he stumbled upon a family from the Netherlands, Eric and Monique Meyer and their son Andy, who gave him food and water and ran for help. A rescue helicopter found him roughly 4 hours after the amputation. By then, he had lost 40 pounds, including 25% of his blood. Aron later said that if he had cut his arm off any sooner, he would have bled to death before anyone found him, and if he hadn't done it at all, search teams would have eventually found his body still pinned to the wall. Sometimes, though, survival doesn't begin with a single moment of desperation. Sometimes it begins with a mother's last words. On Christmas Eve, 1971, a 17-year-old girl named Juliane Koepcke boarded a plane in Lima, Peru, with her mother Maria. They were heading to the city of Pucallpa to spend the holidays with Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm, a zoologist who ran a research station deep in the Amazon rainforest. The airline was Lanza, a Peruvian carrier with a reputation so poor that Juliane's father had urged them not to fly with it. But it was the holiday season. Every other flight was booked, and they were desperate to make the trip. The flight was supposed to last about an hour. For the first 25 minutes, everything was fine. Passengers received snacks, and the plane hummed steadily through clear skies. Then they hit a wall of thunderclouds. The turbulence came on fast, violent shaking that sent luggage tumbling from the overhead compartments. Lightning flashed outside the windows, and the cabin filled with screams. Juliane looked to her mother, who stared out the window and said very calmly, words that would be the last her daughter ever heard from her. She told Juliane that it was all over. Seconds later, a bolt of lightning struck the right engine, and the plane, a Lockheed Electra turboprop, broke apart at an altitude of roughly 10,000 feet above the jungle floor. What happened next defies every law of probability that exists. Juliane was ripped from the disintegrating aircraft, still strapped to her row of seats, and fell nearly 2 miles through open sky. She later described the sensation of spinning, the roar of wind, and then the canopy of the rainforest rushing toward her. The row of seats is believed to have acted like a crude helicopter blade, slowing her descent just enough, and the thick jungle vegetation cushioned her landing. Experts would later theorize that the updraft from the very thunderstorm that destroyed the plane may have also helped slow her fall. As many as 14 other passengers also survived the initial crash, their bodies found in the jungle by search teams in the days that followed, but none of them survived long enough to be rescued. They had been sitting there, wounded and alone, waiting for a help that never came. Juliane woke the next morning on the forest floor, alone, with a broken collarbone, a deep gash on her right arm, a swollen eye, a torn ligament in her knee, and a concussion. One of her shoes was missing, and her glasses were gone, leaving her severely nearsighted in an environment where vision could mean the difference between stepping over a venomous snake and stepping on one. 91 other people aboard the flight, including her mother, were dead. For the next 11 days, Juliane walked through the Amazon. She had no food except a bag of candy she found in the wreckage. Her wounds attracted insects, and at one point, she discovered that fly larvae had burrowed into a gash on her arm. She counted 35 maggots as she extracted them using gasoline she later found at a lumberjack's camp. She waded through streams infested with crocodiles and piranhas, using a stick to test the water before each step, a technique her father had taught her during their years at the research station. She passed the remains of other passengers who had survived the initial fall, but died waiting for help. At one point, she considered eating frogs she found near a stream, but didn't have the strength to catch them, which may have saved her life, as she later learned they were poison dart frogs. On the 11th day, she followed a stream to a small shelter built by loggers where she collapsed. The next morning, the loggers found her, treated her wounds as best they could, and transported her by canoe back to civilization. In the years that followed, Juliane completed her education, earned a doctorate in biology, and became a zoologist like her parents. She returned to Peru to run the Panguana research station her family had founded, the same station she had been trying to reach on that Christmas Eve flight. The filmmaker Werner Herzog, who had himself narrowly avoided being on the same doomed flight while scouting locations for a movie, tracked Juliane down decades later and made a documentary about her called Wings of Hope. The ocean, of course, has its own way of testing the limits of human endurance. On the night of February 4th, 1982, a 29-year-old naval architect and sailor named Stephen Callahan was 7 days into a solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. He had departed from El Hierro in the Canary Islands aboard the Napoleon Solo, a 21-foot sloop he had designed and built himself, bound for Antigua in the Caribbean. He was an experienced sailor, but on that particular night, something collided with the hull of his boat during a storm, something he later believed was a whale. The impact tore a hole in the vessel, and within minutes, the Napoleon Solo was taking on water faster than Callahan could bail it out. In the darkness, with waves crashing over the deck, Callahan inflated a 6-person life raft and abandoned ship. But before the sinking vessel disappeared entirely, he dove back aboard multiple times, retrieving a sleeping bag, a short spear gun, some food, navigation charts, solar stills for making drinking water, and, crucially, a copy of a survival manual called Sea Survival, written by a man named Dougal Robertson, another ocean survivor, whose story would prove eerily similar to what lay ahead of Callahan. For 76 days, Stephen Callahan drifted across the Atlantic Ocean in a raft that measured roughly 6 feet across. He was utterly alone, surrounded by nothing but open water in every direction. The first days were the most desperate. His raft leaked constantly, requiring him to bail water and make repairs with improvised patches. The solar stills he relied on for drinking water were an old World War II prototype that came without instructions. He had to cut one apart and reverse engineer how it worked before he could produce any fresh water at all, a process that cost him precious time and one of his 3 stills. When they finally functioned, they produced, on average, about a pint of water a day. He supplemented this by collecting rainwater in every container he could improvise. Callahan set up a routine to keep himself sane, exercising, navigating by the stars and his charts, repairing the raft when it leaked, and fishing with his spear gun. He caught dorado and triggerfish, and collected flying fish that landed in the raft at night. He used his solar stills to produce about a pint of drinking water a day, barely enough to survive. He spotted 9 ships during his drift, most of them crossing through the 2 major sea lanes he passed, but not one of them saw his flares or his tiny raft bobbing on the waves. Each failed signal was a devastation. The raft itself became a small ecosystem. Fish gathered beneath it, barnacles grew on its underside, and seabirds circled overhead, drawn by the marine life that trailed this strange floating island. On the evening of April 20th, 1982, Callahan spotted lights on the horizon. It was Marie Galante, a small island southeast of Guadeloupe. The next morning, his 76th day adrift, local fishermen found him. They had been drawn to the raft not by distress signals, but by the flock of birds hovering above it. By the time he was pulled from the water, Callahan had drifted over 1,800 nautical miles. He later wrote a best-selling memoir called Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, and years later served as a consultant on the film Life of Pi, advising director Ong Lee on the realities of surviving alone in a life raft. Mountains, meanwhile, demand a different kind of endurance. In June of 1985, 2 young British climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, stood on the summit of Ciula Grande, a towering peak in the Peruvian Andes that rises over 20,000 feet into thin, frozen air. They had just completed the first ascent of the mountain's west face, a sheer wall of ice and rock that had defeated every previous attempt. It should have been the proudest moment of their lives. Instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare. On the descent, while climbing down an ice cliff on the North Ridge, Simpson slipped. He landed hard, and the impact drove his tibia straight up through his knee joint, shattering the bone and destroying ligaments, cartilage, and nerves. He knew instantly that the injury was catastrophic. At that altitude, in those conditions, a broken leg was essentially a death sentence. There was no rescue team coming, no helicopter that could reach them, no way to call for help. It was just the 2 of them, connected by a rope, in a blizzard, on the side of a mountain. Yates made a decision that most climbers would consider impossible. Using their 2 ropes tied together for a combined length of 300 feet, he began lowering Simpson down the mountain, working in stages, carving out a seat in the snow to brace himself against Simpson's weight, then lowering him 1 rope length at a time. For hours this worked. They descended roughly 3,000 feet this way. But then, in the darkness and the storm, Yates accidentally lowered Simpson over the edge of a cliff. Simpson was now dangling in midair, his full weight on the rope, unable to climb up because his frostbitten hands couldn't tie the knots needed to ascend. Above him, Yates was being slowly dragged from his snow seat. He couldn't see Simpson, couldn't hear him over the wind, and couldn't pull him back up. After an hour and a half of holding on, with his own grip failing and certain death approaching for both of them, Yates did the only thing he could. He cut the rope. Simpson fell into a deep crevasse. Yates, assuming his partner was dead, descended to the glacier alone, racked with guilt. But Simpson was alive. He had landed on a narrow ice ledge inside the crevasse, in total darkness, with the void dropping away beneath him to an unknowable depth. His leg was shattered in multiple places. His hands were frostbitten, and the cold was indescribable. For hours he lay there, certain that this ice shelf deep inside a mountain was going to be his tomb. Then he made a decision that seemed counterintuitive, almost insane. Instead of trying to climb up, which was impossible with one leg and frozen hands, he lowered himself deeper into the crevasse, following a faint sliver of light he noticed far below. That light led him to a ramp of snow that angled toward a small opening, and through it, he dragged himself out onto the glacier. Over the next 3.5 days, with no food, almost no water, and a leg that was shattered in multiple places, Simpson crawled out of the crevasse and across 5 miles of glacier and rocky moraine. He moved in agonizing increments, setting himself small goals, telling himself he had 20 minutes to reach the next rock, the next ridge, the next shadow on the ground. At one point, exhausted and delirious, he crawled through the expedition's latrine area, covering himself in human waste, but the smell acted like smelling salts and snapped him back to awareness. He suddenly realized he was within 100 yards of base camp. He arrived just hours before Yates and their third expedition member, Richard Hawking, had planned to leave. He had been dead for 4 days as far as anyone knew. Simpson later wrote Touching the Void, which became one of the most celebrated survival books ever published. He underwent 6 surgeries on his leg, and doctors told him he would never climb again. He proved them wrong. On October 13, 1972, a chartered Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild turboprop lifted off from Mendoza, Argentina, carrying 45 people. Most of the passengers were members of the Old Christians Club, a rugby team from Montevideo, along with friends and family heading to Santiago, Chile, for an exhibition match. The pilots, navigating through the Andes Mountains, made a fatal error. The co-pilot, who was flying the aircraft, mistakenly believed they had already passed over the town of Curico, the landmark that signaled the turn north towards Santiago. He hadn't. The plane was still deep in the mountains, and when he began descending through the clouds, the passengers looked out the windows and saw something terrifying. A mountain face barely 20 feet away. The plane clipped a ridge, the right wing sheared off, then the left. The tail section ripped away, sucking several passengers out into the freezing air. What remained of the fuselage, essentially a metal tube with no wings and no tail, slid down the mountainside at tremendous speed before coming to rest in a snowfield at an elevation of nearly 12,000 feet. 7 people had been pulled from the plane during the breakup. 5 more died on impact, including the pilot. Among the survivors was Nando Parado, a 22-year-old whose skull was fractured so badly that when he pressed on the wound, he could feel shattered bone shifting against the surface of his brain. He lay unconscious for nearly 2 days before waking to a world of ice and death. The search for the missing plane lasted 8 days before it was called off. Rescue aircraft flew over the crash site multiple times, but couldn't distinguish the white fuselage from the surrounding snow. The survivors, now 33 in number, were left entirely on their own. They huddled inside the wreckage at night, stacking airplane seats to build walls against the wind. The fuselage offered some protection from the elements, but at that altitude the temperature regularly plummeted far below zero. They had no winter clothing, no sleeping bags, and no heating of any kind. Their food, mainly candy bars and a few bottles of wine, was gone within a week. At that altitude, in sub-zero temperatures, their bodies burned through calories at an extraordinary rate, just trying to stay warm. Several of the survivors had medical training, including Roberto Canessa. who was a medical student at the time, and he did what he could to splint broken bones and treat wounds with the limited resources available. They melted snow for drinking water using sheets of aluminum from the plane, heated by the sun. They tried to signal the search aircraft that flew overhead, writing SOS with lipstick on the fuselage and fashioning a cross from luggage in the snow. But from the air, the white plane was invisible against the white landscape. On the 8th day, they found a small transistor radio among the wreckage and heard the news broadcast that confirmed their worst fear. The search for their plane had been officially called off. They were given up for dead. Starvation was approaching fast. And then came the conversation none of them wanted to have. The dead lay frozen in the snow around them, preserved by the cold. After days of agonizing debate, some of the survivors made the decision to eat the flesh of those who had died. It was not a decision made lightly or without tears. Several refused at first, choosing to starve rather than cross that line. But as the days stretched into weeks and bodies weakened further, the choice became binary. One of the survivors, Roberto Canessa, later explained his reasoning simply. He had seen how mothers cried when they lost their sons, and he did not want his own mother to go through that. Another survivor described a pact the group made. If any of them died, they would be happy to put their bodies to the service of the rest. On the 16th day, an avalanche buried the fuselage while the survivors slept inside. 8 more people died, suffocated under the weight of the snow. Those who remained had to dig themselves out, and then, trapped with the bodies of their friends, were forced once again to make the same terrible choice. After 2 months, it became clear that no one was coming to rescue them. If they were going to survive, they would have to save themselves. 3 of the strongest men, Parado, Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin, set out on foot to cross the Andes and find help. Vizintin eventually turned back to conserve rations for the other 2. For 10 days, Parado and Canessa walked through some of the most treacherous terrain on the planet, climbing to altitudes of over 15,000 feet, with no gear, no map, and no real idea of where they were going. They finally encountered a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan on the far side of the mountains. Parado scrawled a note on a piece of paper and threw it across a river, wrapped around a stone. It read, in part, that he had 14 friends wounded at the crash site, that they had no food, and that they needed help. Catalan rode 10 hours on horseback to alert the authorities. Helicopters arrived 2 days later. The pilots who flew the rescue mission were stunned when they saw the terrain that Parado and Canessa had crossed on foot, mountain passes and glacial valleys that would have challenged experienced alpine climbers with full equipment. When the news broke that survivors had been found, the world celebrated, but the celebration was complicated by what came next. The survivors initially told the press they had eaten cheese and vegetation to stay alive. But within days, photographs taken at the crash site surfaced in Chilean newspapers, showing unmistakable evidence of what had actually sustained them. The survivors held a press conference in Montevideo on December 28th, where they told the truth. The public reaction was initially one of revulsion, but it shifted quickly toward understanding when one of the survivors invoked the symbolism of the Last Supper, and a priest confirmed that their actions were a matter of necessity, not sin. Pope Paul VI sent the survivors a telegram indicating that their actions were acceptable given the circumstances. Of the original 45 people aboard the plane, 16 walked off that mountain alive. Their ordeal had lasted 72 days. The ocean took on an entirely different kind of horror for a man named Harrison O'Keefe. On May 26, 2013, Koepcke was working as the cook aboard a tugboat called the Jaskin 4, which was helping stabilize an oil tanker at a Chevron platform about 20 miles off the coast of Nigeria. He was 29 years old, newly married, and looking forward to leave that was set to start in just 3 days. At around 4:30 in the morning, while Koepcke was in the bathroom wearing nothing but his boxer shorts, a massive rogue wave slammed into the vessel. The tugboat flipped and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean within minutes, coming to rest upside down on the seafloor at a depth of roughly 100 feet. 11 of the 12 crew members drowned, most of them locked in their cabins behind watertight doors, a safety precaution designed to protect against the pirates who regularly operated in those waters. That same precaution sealed their fate. Koepcke, thrown around in the darkness as the ship rolled, groped his way through the flooding corridors, blind and disoriented, water rushing in from every direction. He could hear the voices of his crewmates fading one by one as the water overtook them. He didn't know it then, but they were not escaping to the surface. They were dying. Koepcke found his way into the engineer's office, where a pocket of trapped air, roughly 4 feet high, sat against the ceiling of the now inverted room. He rigged a makeshift platform out of debris to keep his body partially above the water, slowing the onset of hypothermia. The water temperature at that depth was frigid, and wearing nothing but boxer shorts, his body temperature was dropping steadily. He found 2 life vests, and the small flashlights attached to them became his only sources of light in the absolute blackness. He also discovered a bottle of Coca-Cola and some sardines, the only provisions he would have for his entire ordeal. In the total darkness, wearing nothing but his underwear, with no meaningful food, and the sound of marine creatures feeding on the bodies of his colleagues echoing through the hull, Koepcke waited. He had assumed his crewmates had escaped to the surface when the boat went down. He had no way of knowing he was the only one still alive. The sounds that drifted through the water, cracking, shifting, the unmistakable sound of something feeding, were sounds he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He prayed, reciting a psalm his wife had texted him, over and over. For 60 hours, roughly 2.5 days, Harrison Koepcke sat in that air pocket. Experts later estimated that the trapped air, compressed by the water pressure at that depth, contained just enough oxygen to keep one person alive for about that long. Any longer, and carbon dioxide buildup would have killed him. When South African divers finally arrived to inspect the wreck and recover the bodies, they had already found 3 dead crew members. Then one of the divers felt something grab his hand. He thought it was another corpse, but the hand squeezed back. The diver's reaction, captured on his helmet camera, became one of the most viewed rescue videos on the internet. They fitted Koepcke with a diving helmet, guided him to a diving bell, and slowly decompressed him over 3 additional days to prevent the bends. When he reached the surface, he learned that he had been underwater for 3 days. He had thought it was only 1 night. Remarkably, Koepcke went on to train as a professional diver, and the very man who discovered him alive presented him with his diving certification. Some survival stories, though, test not the body, but the brain itself. On the afternoon of September 13th, 1848, a 25-year-old railroad construction foreman named Phineas Gage was at work near the town of Cavendish, Vermont. His job was to prepare rock for blasting, a process that involved drilling a hole, filling it with gunpowder, laying a fuse, covering the powder with sand, and then packing it all down with a heavy iron tamping rod. The rod was 3 feet 7 inches long, 1 1/4 inches thick, and weighed 13.5 pounds. It was essentially a metal javelin. On that particular afternoon, just after 4:30, something went wrong. Gage turned his head to speak to one of his men at the very moment he was tamping down the powder. The iron rod scraped against the rock, created a spark, and the gunpowder exploded. The blast launched the rod upward like a missile. It entered Gage's skull just below his left cheekbone, destroyed his left eye, plowed through the left frontal lobe of his brain, and exited through the top of his head before landing some 80 feet away, slick with blood and brain matter. His horrified crew watched him collapse and convulse on the ground. And then, impossibly, he spoke. Within minutes, Phineas Gage was sitting upright. He walked under his own power to a nearby ox cart and rode to town, where he sat on the porch of his hotel, chatting with passers-by who were somewhat startled by the volcano of shattered bone protruding from the top of his skull. When the doctor arrived, Gage reportedly greeted him by saying there was enough business here to keep him busy. Over the following weeks, Gage survived infection, fever, and the loss of a significant portion of his brain. He never lost consciousness, and within 2 months, he was walking around town. But the man who recovered was not the same man who had gone to work that afternoon. Those who knew Gage before the accident described him as responsible, capable, and well-liked, the most efficient foreman in the company's employ. Afterward, according to his physician Dr. John Harlow, Gage became fitful, irreverent, impatient, and profane. He made crude remarks, showed little regard for the feelings of others, and couldn't seem to plan or follow through on anything. His friends said he was no longer Gage. The injury had obliterated something essential in him, some invisible architecture of personality that resided in the front of the brain. He was fired from his railroad job and struggled to find steady employment. He exhibited himself and the tamping rod at P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York, where crowds paid to gawk at the man with the hole in his head. He worked for a time at a livery stable in New Hampshire before eventually moving to Chile, where he worked as a long-distance stagecoach driver for several years. This last detail is significant because driving a stagecoach through the Chilean countryside required considerable planning, patience, social skills, and quick reaction times, suggesting that Gage may have recovered more of his faculties over time than the early sensational accounts suggest. Some modern researchers believe the personality changes lasted perhaps 4 years before slowly reverting, a remarkable testament to the brain's capacity for healing. He died in 1860, nearly 12 years after the accident, from epileptic seizures, almost certainly related to the injury. His skull and the tamping iron are still on display at Harvard's Warren Anatomical Museum, and his case remains one of the most important in the history of neuroscience, the first real evidence that specific regions of the brain are linked to personality and behavior. Speaking of falling from the sky, on January 26, 1972, just 2 days after Juliane Koepcke's rescue from the Amazon, a 22-year-old Serbian flight attendant named Vesna Vulovic reported for duty on JAT Yugoslav Airlines Flight 367. She wasn't even supposed to be on the flight. The airline had confused her with another stewardess who shared the same first name, and Vesna, who had never been to Denmark before, was happy to take the assignment. The flight left Copenhagen bound for Belgrade with a scheduled stop in Zagreb. 46 minutes after takeoff, at an altitude of 33,330 feet, a bomb hidden in a briefcase in the luggage compartment exploded, The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, tore apart into 3 pieces. The other 27 passengers and crew were killed, most of them sucked out of the fuselage into the freezing air at 6 miles above the earth. Vesna, however, was pinned in place by a food cart in the middle section of the fuselage. That section of the plane, tumbling through the sky, crashed into a heavily wooded, snow-covered hillside near the Czechoslovak village of Srbska Kamenice. A former World War II medic named Bruno Honke found her screaming in the wreckage. She was still alive. Vesna's injuries were catastrophic. She had a fractured skull, 3 broken vertebrae, one of which was completely crushed, a broken pelvis, broken legs, and broken ribs. She was temporarily paralyzed from the waist down and spent days in a coma. When she woke, the first thing she asked for was a cigarette. She had no memory of the explosion, the fall, or the crash, a mercy that spared her the psychological horror of reliving the event. Her hospital room in Prague was placed under 24-hour armed guard because Yugoslav authorities feared that the perpetrators of the bombing might attempt to finish what they started. No visitors were allowed except her parents and her doctors. Guards rotated every 6 hours. She remained hospitalized until June of 1972, after which she was flown to Belgrade and then transferred to a seaside resort in Montenegro to recuperate further. Doctors attributed her survival to several factors. The food cart that pinned her likely prevented her from being ejected. The dense forest and thick snow cushioned the impact, and her unusually low blood pressure, a condition that had nearly disqualified her from becoming a flight attendant in the first place, may have prevented her heart from bursting on impact. Within 10 months, Vesna was walking again, though she limped for the rest of her life. She returned to JAT in a desk role, was celebrated as a national hero in Yugoslavia, and in 1985, Paul McCartney personally presented her with her Guinness World Record certificate for the highest fall survived without a parachute. She passed away in 2016 at the age of 66. She always said she was not lucky, because if she were truly lucky, the accident would never have happened at all. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi unfolds in an entirely different theater of horror, one measured not in altitude or distance, but in the unimaginable destructive power of the atom. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old marine engineer employed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, was in Hiroshima on the final day of a 3-month business trip. He was walking toward the shipyard when he noticed a plane in the sky above the city. A small object dropped from it, connected to parachutes. Then the world turned blazing white. The bomb known as Little Boy detonated at roughly 8:15 in the morning, unleashing the equivalent of 16,000 tons of TNT. Yamaguchi was approximately 3 kilometers, or just under 2 miles, from the epicenter. The blast hurled him into a nearby ditch, ruptured his eardrums, and burned his skin so severely that a doctor who later treated him, a former school classmate, did not recognize his face. Roughly 80,000 people died that day. Yamaguchi was not one of them. He found 2 of his colleagues who had also survived, and together they spent the night in a bomb shelter before making their way to the train station, which had been left largely intact. The next morning, Yamaguchi boarded a train packed with burned and bewildered survivors and traveled overnight to his hometown of Nagasaki, where his wife, Hisako, and infant son, Katsutoshi, lived. The journey took him through a landscape of unimaginable devastation, through streets lined with charred corpses, through fires that still burned, and at one river crossing, he was forced to swim through water thick with floating dead bodies. He arrived on August 8th, badly wounded, bandaged, and half blind, and went to the hospital. A doctor who had been his classmate in school treated his wounds but could not recognize him through the blackened, blistered skin on his face and hands. Despite everything, Yamaguchi reported to work the next day, August 9th. He was sitting in a meeting at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard, trying to describe to his supervisor the devastation he had witnessed in Hiroshima. His boss dismissed the account, telling him he was crazy, that no single bomb could destroy an entire city. At that exact moment, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, with a yield of roughly 21 kilotons, detonated over the Urakami Valley in Nagasaki. Once again, Yamaguchi was approximately 3 kilometers from the blast. This time, the concrete walls of the office building and the surrounding hills absorbed much of the shockwave. He survived, though he suffered additional burns and injuries. His wife and son also survived. His wife had been away from their home searching for medicine for him and had taken shelter in a train tunnel with their child. In the weeks that followed, Yamaguchi became severely ill from radiation poisoning. His hair fell out, his skin peeled, and he vomited for days. And yet, he recovered. He went on to work as a translator for the American Occupation Forces, then returned to Mitsubishi, designing oil tankers for decades. In 2009, nearly 64 years after the bombings, the Japanese government officially recognized him as the only person confirmed to have survived both atomic blasts, granting him the designation of Niju Hibakusha, or double survivor. He spent his final years advocating for nuclear disarmament, speaking at the United Nations, and writing poetry. He died in 2010, at the age of 93, from stomach cancer. In 1994, a 39-year-old Italian police officer and former Olympic pentathlete named Mauro Prosperi decided he wanted a new kind of challenge. He signed up for the Marathon des Sables, an ultra-marathon that covers roughly 155 miles across the Sahara Desert in southern Morocco over 6 days. It is widely considered the toughest foot race on the planet, and before the race, participants are required to sign a form indicating where they want their body sent in the event of their death. Prosperi trained obsessively, running 25 miles a day and deliberately reducing his water intake to prepare his body for dehydration. His wife Cinzia thought he was insane, especially after she learned that participants had to sign a document specifying where their remains should be sent in the event of death. But Prosperi was drawn to the challenge the way a moth is drawn to light, compulsively and without reservation. He had represented Italy in the modern pentathlon at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, and the adrenaline of competition still coursed through his veins. He wanted to feel that rush again, and the Sahara was calling. The first 3 days went well. By the 4th day, the longest and most dangerous stage of the race, Prosperi was running in 7th place. Temperatures that afternoon climbed to 115 degrees. Then, somewhere in the open desert, a sandstorm rolled in with such ferocity that visibility dropped to nothing. The race was paused, but Prosperi was already beyond reach. When the storm cleared, he had no idea where he was. He tried to navigate with his compass, but without landmarks, the desert offered only an endless, shifting ocean of sand. He was completely and utterly lost. After 24 hours, his food and water were gone. He stumbled upon a small, abandoned structure, a marabout shrine, a tomb built to honor a Muslim holy man. Inside, he found shade, and on the low ceiling, bats. He decapitated them, ate their organs, and drank their blood. A helicopter passed overhead, but his emergency flare, which was only the size of a pen, was too small to be seen. When it became clear that rescue was not coming, Prosperi reached a grim conclusion. He believed he was facing a long, agonizing death. He wrote a goodbye letter to his wife with a piece of charcoal and then slit his wrists with a knife. But his body, so severely dehydrated that his blood had thickened to a paste, refused to let him die. The blood clotted almost immediately. He woke the next morning, still alive. That failed attempt to end his life somehow reignited something in him. He left the shrine and started walking. For the next several days, he moved through the desert, eating lizards, snakes, and insects, licking morning dew from rocks, and drinking his own urine. He walked nearly 200 miles off course, crossing the border from Morocco into Algeria without realizing it. On the 8th day, he found an oasis. On the 9th, a young nomadic shepherd girl spotted him and led him to a camp where Berber women gave him goat's milk and laid him in the shade. When Algerian soldiers arrived and learned who he was, they blindfolded him and took him to a military base. He had lost over 35 pounds. It took him nearly 2 years to fully recover, and his liver was permanently damaged. But Mauro Prosperi went back to the Marathon des Sables and completed it multiple times. He later said that those days in the Sahara were somehow the happiest of his life, that the desert had spared him, and he felt a connection to it he could never quite explain. While the Sahara tested Mauro Prosperi with heat and sand, the Pacific Ocean tested Jose Salvador Alvarenga with something even more terrifying: the sheer vastness of emptiness. On November 17, 2012, Alvarenga, a 35-year-old Salvadoran fisherman living on the coast of Chiapas, Mexico, set out on what was supposed to be a 30-hour deep-sea fishing trip. He was an experienced shark hunter, a member of a rough crew of fishermen who called themselves Los Tiburoneros. His usual partner couldn't make the trip, so he brought along a 22-year-old rookie named Ezequiel Cordoba, a young man he barely knew. The two men motored out in a small, open-top fiberglass skiff about 25 feet long, with no sails, no oars, and a single outboard motor. They caught a massive haul of fish and were heading back to shore when a storm hit with savage force. For 5 days, enormous waves battered the boat. To keep from capsizing, they dumped over 1,000 pounds of fish overboard, along with most of their equipment. The motor flooded and died. The radio worked just long enough for Alvarenga to send a single distress call to his employer, who organized a search that lasted only 2 days before being called off. Their nets, their tackle, and any hope of mechanized rescue were all gone. The ocean had swallowed everything, and now it had them. For the first few weeks, Alvarenga and Cordoba survived by catching fish with their bare hands and trapping sea turtles. They drank turtle blood when there was no rainwater. They collected plastic bottles and an oil drum that drifted past and used them to store water when it rained. But Cordoba couldn't handle the raw food. After roughly 4 months adrift, he stopped eating. He became weak, then delirious. One morning, he drank a sip of water, said a few quiet words, and died in the boat. Alvarenga, overcome with grief, kept the body on board for several days, talking to it, before finally sliding it into the water and watching it drift away. For the next 9 months, Alvarenga was completely alone on the Pacific Ocean. He developed a routine of catching birds that landed on the boat, eating their raw flesh, and seasoning it with seawater. He caught small sharks by grabbing their dorsal fins as they swam alongside the hull. He consumed their livers, which were rich in oils and nutrients. He drank the blood of sea turtles when there was no rain, a source of hydration that gave him energy and kept him alive during the driest stretches. He collected any floating debris he encountered, plastic bottles, containers, bits of rope, and repurposed them for survival. He kept himself busy with strange rituals, sometimes talking to the birds before eating them, sometimes playing games with them on the deck of the boat. He played mental games to keep himself sane, sometimes holding conversations with imaginary companions, sometimes talking to God, sometimes simply narrating his own actions aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. He saw container ships on the horizon and tried desperately to signal them, but not one responded. Each passing vessel brought a wave of hope, followed immediately by crushing despair. On January 30th, 2014, after 438 days adrift, the longest recorded survival at sea in modern history, Alvarenga's boat washed up on a tiny islet called Tile, part of the remote Eben Atoll in the Marshall Islands. He had drifted nearly 7,000 miles from where he started. He abandoned the boat, swam to shore, and stumbled upon a beach house owned by a local couple, barely able to stand, his hair long and wild, his body ravaged but alive. Oceanographers from the University of Hawaii later modeled his likely drift path using wind and current data and confirmed that his account was entirely plausible. Alvarenga returned to El Salvador, where he reconnected with a daughter he had not seen in years. He wrote a book about the experience, but has never returned to the sea. He says the ocean still haunts him at night. In the summer of 1972, the same year that a rugby team's plane was breaking apart over the Andes and a flight attendant was plummeting from 33,000 feet over Czechoslovakia, a Scottish dairy farmer named Dougal Robertson was living out a dream. He had sold his farm, purchased a 43-foot wooden schooner called the Lucette, and set out with his wife Lynn, their 18-year-old daughter Anne, 16-year-old son Douglas, 9-year-old twin sons Neil and Sandy, and a young Welsh hitchhiker named Robin Williams who had joined the voyage. For 17 months, the family sailed across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, and out into the Pacific, visiting ports and seeing the world. On June 15, 1972, roughly 200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, 3 orca whales struck the hull of the Lucette with what Douglas Robertson later described as sledgehammer blows. The largest of the whales split its own head open on impact, blood pouring from the wound. The wooden hull cracked open below the waterline, and the Lucette sank in under a minute. The 6 people aboard scrambled into an inflatable rubber life raft and a 9-foot fiberglass dinghy called the Edna Mare, grabbing what they could in the chaos. A kitchen knife, a bag of onions, a tin of biscuits, 10 oranges, 6 lemons, some glucose sweets, a handful of flares, and Lynn's sewing box, which would prove to be one of the most valuable items they had. They had enough water for about 10 days and emergency rations for 3. No one in the world knew they were missing, and they were well beyond any shipping lane. It would be 5 weeks before anyone even realized they hadn't arrived at their next port. Dougal, a former merchant Navy sailor, made the decision to head north toward the doldrums, where rain was more frequent so they could collect drinking water. He jury-rigged a sail from scraps of material and used the dinghy as a towboat, pulling the life raft behind it. The first days were brutal. The sun was relentless, They were rationing water in tiny sips, and the vastness of the empty Pacific was psychologically crushing. Every direction looked the same, an unbroken horizon of blue water under blue sky. The inflatable raft held out for 16 days before it became unusable, its seams giving way from constant exposure to salt water and sun, forcing all 6 people to crowd into the tiny dinghy with their supplies. 6 people in a boat meant for 3. They sat on each other, slept in shifts, and took turns dangling their legs over the side to make room. They caught sea turtles and drank the blood, ate raw dorado and flying fish, and used the kitchen knife and scraps of material to fashion improvised tools and containers. Lynn's sewing kit provided needles and thread for repairs, and the family worked together in a tight, exhausting rotation to keep the dinghy afloat and moving. Douglas, the 16-year-old, later recalled that the experience forced them to function as a unit in a way they never had before, every person responsible for specific tasks, every action a matter of life and death. They fended off sharks that circled the boat by slapping the water and making noise. They dried turtle meat in the sun to preserve it. They collected rainwater in every available container. On the 38th day, July 23, 1972, Dougal spotted a ship on the horizon. He fired a distress flare. Nothing happened. He fired a second. The ship, a Japanese fishing trawler called the Toka Maru II, altered course. When its horn sounded, the Robertson family knew they were saved. They had drifted over 750 miles. They arrived severely emaciated, sunburned, and covered in boils and sores, having lost up to 40% of their body weight. Anne was near death, but all 6 survived. Dougal wrote a book about the experience called Survive the Savage Sea, which became a classic of maritime literature. He also wrote a survival manual that, years later, would end up in the hands of Stephen Callahan, who used it to stay alive during his own 76-day ordeal in the Atlantic. What threads through all of these stories, every single one of them, is something that can't quite be measured or fully explained. It goes beyond physical fitness or survival training or even luck, though all of those played their parts. There is a moment in each of these stories where the person should have died, where every calculation pointed to death, and yet something inside them said no. If these stories resonate with you and you want to hear more like them, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It makes a real difference and helps us keep telling these stories. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and remember, you are stronger than you think.